This is Chapter 3 of The Judgement by Terry Daniels. If you haven't heard this from the start, please return back to the YouTube channel and have a listen to Chapters 1 and 2. If you'd like to continue, please note that this particular chapter contains language and scenes of violence that some may find offensive. The Judgement by Terry Daniels. Chapter 3. Edward. The resort at Pensley Bay was a medium-sized complex of wooden chalets and holiday flats, totalling over 100 standard to luxury dwellings, and with easy access to the entertainment lounge, Olympic-sized swimming pool and sports field. Those families who came here during the summer months could expect all the trappings and expectations of a week of eating, drinking, having fun, and hopefully good weather. Prices were reasonable and the food plentiful. During this era of British holiday making, there was a sudden surge to the coast to escape the drab existence of town life. Each adult and child could expect a packed, fun-filled week around the 10 acres which enclosed the buildings. The sports field would regularly host a mini fun Olympics where mums and dads could compete with each other in timeless games. Egg and spoon, 50-yard hop, the three-legged race and book-balancing head skills, to name a few. All to the merriment of all the other guests who would crowd around the running track and cheer on whoever they wanted. If the swimming pool was scheduled, never after lunch, then competitions of a more serious nature would ensue. Miss Pensley Bay was a firm favourite and was often hotly contested. Many families would come from all over the southeast just for the chance for their glamorous wife or daughter to be ogled by hundreds of strangers with a chance to wear the gold sash for that particular week. The competition would normally be judged by the site manager, and the responsibility could be a heavy one. His decision, however, was always final. There were many rumours of money changing hands, but this was never proved. All ages were catered for. The elders could benefit from that week's glamorous granny. Even the granddads got their chance to shine with the knobbly knees competition. All was done in pure, innocent humour, as everyone let their hair down. This was their week off after a hard year's graft in factories and mines, and they were going to live every minute to the full. If the English weather let them down, then they would all be herded into the entertainment room for bingo or quizzes. The jacketed staff would be working hard to entertain. There was many a good cash tip at the end of the week for those that could charm the hearts of a Mr. and Mrs. Average. If they could cop a feel from the daughter, then their week would be even better. Everything was geared to make the paying customer feel wanted and to forget about their everyday lives. All strands of life were brought together. It didn't matter who you were as you sat next to them at bingo, dinner, or cheered on the cutest baby competition. You could even strike up a conversation with your fellow holidaymakers about the events of the day, or all sing along with the entertainment team and resident band, who bravely played the hits of the time. Away from the meeting places, however, certain distinctions could be made as each family returned to their home for the week. First to open their doors would be the full boarders and their holiday flats. These families had thought of everything and could afford a little extra luxury. Meals 3 times a day and free access to all entertainment with possibly a complimentary donkey ride. Next to take off their shoes would be the chalets on the outer circle. Half-boarders would be permitted breakfast and dinner, but needed to make do with lunchtime. The chalets were colder and smaller but self-contained, yet some of the far ones had their own communal block for the toilets and baths, which was shared by those in that level. For some, it was still like being in some exotic land as they were used to outside toilets. On the far side near the perimeter were the caravans. These belonged to the self-caterers. It was the simplest of accommodation, but perfectly adequate for those families on a budget. Access to the entertainment and swimming pool was permitted with a weekly charge. You made do because it was a holiday. These outer set of caravans were reasonably close together, and everyone heard everyone's business. To John and Ruth Dargett, they were happy being caravan people. This was the second time they had been to Pensley Bay in as many years, and along with their son Edward, they had enjoyed every single minute of every single day. This year was special, as they were able to afford a whole week instead of a quick weekend. Ruth was happy to cook the meals. There was always chips at lunchtime if they wandered out to the village along the road. Edward loved chips, freshly wrapped in newspaper with lots of vinegar and salt to burn the lips. He could eat it every day for the rest of his life if he had to. John too always loved the peace here. To be able to relax in the deck chair, supplied for a small supplement, during the day and drink beer at the clubhouse whilst being entertained was bliss. Just the fact of not being covered in coal dust every day was heaven to him. He dearly loved his wife and would always be disappointed when she refused to put her name down for Miss Pensley Bay. "How could I possibly compete with other women?" she would say to John after he had again mentioned it. "The state of my body after giving birth to our Edward, for goodness sake. Besides, I can't enter it when I'm quite clearly a missus." She gave him a loving look and started to get things together to make the breakfast. There was a small stove supplied that was adequate enough to grill a few pieces of bacon and sausage. By also placing the bread on it afterwards, she was able to produce toast and make one of her husband's favourites. Bacon and sausage sandwich with tomato ketchup was a staple favourite on these holidays. John would insist on one every morning. Little Edward would eat a sausage and possibly a slice of fatty toast. She, on the other hand, would make do with a little sugar in her tea. She was watching her weight as usual, and the smell of the bacon fat always made her feel queasy this time of the morning. A cigarette would also fill her up and always went nicely with the tea. "Don't be silly, love," replied John, sitting quietly on the bed. "You would win that competition hands down. What do you think, kiddo?" He looked over towards Edward but got no response. The boy was engrossed in both of his toy cars brought especially for the trip. "Seat yourself, lad," said John, turning back towards his wife. "Ruth, it's going to be another lovely day today. That competition is by the pool. You could wear that two-piece you bought last year." She turned to give him a stern look. "Which I wore last year," she said. "The last weekend we were here. In the same competition, if you remember. When you bullied me into entering. Did I win then?" She stared at him for an answer. "No, you didn't," replied John, moving over to grab her by the waist. "You was robbed last year, as I remember, by that ugly girl from Essex, just because she was a full boarder for the week. This year, though, well, you're twice as sexy, eh?" He squeezed her stomach, making her giggle. "Watch out," she screamed. "I'll drop your bacon on the floor. Get off me, you daft thing." He laughed as he released his hands and smacked her behind playfully. "Let's leave the bacon, girl. Let me take you into the penthouse bedroom." "With Edward just here?" She gave John a slap on the shoulder. "We've hardly room to swing a cat in this caravan. I think I'm giving you too much meat in the mornings." John laughed out loud. "Shouldn't that be the other way round, darling?" He nodded over towards their son. "Look at him. He's so engrossed in those cars he hasn't got a clue what's going on with us." John turned back towards his wife and fell to one knee, looking up at her. "What's wrong with me then, Ruthie? You gone off me or something? Why, only yesterday I was the runner-up in the best head of hair competition. You'd rather have that bloke who won, then?" He laughed again. "Black as the ace of spades he was. His hair was like a huge sponge. It wasn't fair. He was always going to win." "You silly sod," replied his wife. "And don't be rude about that other chap, just because his hair was shinier than yours. Now, sit yourself back up on that bed. Here we are. Here's your sandwich." She placed the plate on his lap. The dinette furniture was normally made up this morning, but she hadn't bothered. It was such a procedure to fold up the double bed and turn into a table for dining on, but John had been snoring again all night and she had insisted he slept in the kitchen area. She could still hear him, but at least it wasn't next to her ear. Once John had vacated, Edward had woken and he had got in next to her for the rest of the night. She loved her baby boy, even though he was now 9, and thought himself grown up. Was always trying to tell her that he was almost an adult now. Didn't moan when he crawled in with her last night, though, did he? She looked over at him and sighed. He was a picture of pure innocence. "Edward, you want a sausage this morning?" She saw John smirk again, but ignored him. "You need to eat something before you go out playing. I suppose you'll be wanting chips from the village when you get back." "Chips?" said Edward, looking up from his cars. "Can't I have some now, Mum?" "Don't be silly, love. Not at breakfast. Honestly, you two. Both as daft as each other." She put some ketchup on a small cracked plate, placed 2 sausages on it and handed it over to him. At the smell of the food, Edward stopped with his cars and took the plate gratefully. Ruth smiled again and began to tidy up the grill area. She would let the fat of the meat cool down before putting it away. Didn't seem any point in washing it, as she would only be using it again tomorrow morning, no doubt. They would need some more bacon, though, from the shop up the road in the village. She made a mental note to get some when they were there buying chips from the fish place next door. It was a pretty little village, somewhere she dreamed she would like to retire. She particularly liked the little thatched cottage on the corner of the so-called High Street. It was only 5 little shops and a pub. It just seemed so idyllic to her after living all her life in a busy town with the smoke, the cars and the noise. It was a good life she had now, she knew that, but there seemed so much more. The world was a huge place and she hoped to visit some of it one day. There was talk of holidays in Spain becoming popular in the next few years. Going on a plane. Imagine that. She had talked with John about it a few nights ago, before he had drunk too many pints of mild, but he had just laughed at her. "Imagine the heat and the horrible food," he had told her. "Then there's the foreign language and the dodgy stomachs from all that muck they eat. Not to mention the beer would be horrible. My old man went out there during the war and had the trots for weeks on it. No pubs out there, you know. No bingo. It would be boring, love. You can't beat an English holiday camp, you know." She had listened to all of this and had let him talk it out. What did he know? She looked over at her 2 men, the loves of her life. Where would she be without them? Perhaps John had been right. Did it matter what was going on in the world? They were happy as they were. It was the early 1970s after all, much better than in her parents' day. They had endured the war. If that was what the world was about, then maybe they can keep it. She noticed that both plates were empty. "Pass those plates over and I'll wash them through." She gestured to both of them and they obediently handed them to her. "Then I'm going outside for my cigarette and finish my tea. What's our plan for today?" "We're off to play Pirates in the Wood," said Edward excitedly. "Bobby said we can stick with the same group as yesterday. Harry is going to be there. He's the same age as me. We're going to make some pats first before we go." "And who is this Bobby then?" she asked, knowing full well he was the group leader employed by the camp to take care of the children all day, whilst the parents were free to do what they wanted. She smiled again. Maybe her and John could come back to the caravan a little later, while Edward was playing pirates. They would have complete privacy and they hadn't made love in months. It would just be the 2 of them and seemed very exciting. "He's our leader, Mum. He's so much fun. He's got a haircut like a teddy boy with lots of stuff in his hair that makes it shine in the sun. He's always getting us to play hiding games and stuff. But don't worry, I'll make sure I'm back at lunchtime for the chips." "I don't doubt it for a moment, Edward." She laughed and looked at her husband. "John, can we go outside for a moment? I want to have my cigarette and ask you something." She watched as he grunted a yes and rose up to follow her out of the tiny door of the caravan. There was a small plastic window on it and a tiny brown curtain pulled back to allow in the light. The door wobbled slightly as she pushed it open, and they went down the 2 steps leading onto the grass. Either side of them and opposite were more caravans, identical aside from the odd washing line or bicycle left outside. All were occupied, and it was a well-known fact that if you listened carefully you could pick out all the conversations going on that morning. It was a cramped way of living, but everyone here was for a week only, and were all determined to have a good time. "What is it, love?" asked John as Ruth finally lit up her cigarette, inhaled deeply, and looked at her husband intently. "What are we up to this morning? Edward's off to play pirates all morning with the rest of the kids on the camp. That leaves me and you with 3 or 4 hours on our own to do what we like. I thought we could stay in the caravan for a while, and I'm off to play a few cards with those lads I met in the social bar last night," John interrupted bluntly. "It's all been arranged. I thought I told you last night, love." Ruth looked at him with exasperation. "You were unable to tell me anything last night with the amount of beer you drunk. Why, for goodness sake, are you meeting them again so soon?" "We're only here for a week. I've paid for that bloody social club, so don't make any sense by sitting in the caravan all morning. This is my holiday as well, you know. That's why I thought you might like to enter that beauty pageant this morning. Stop you from being bored." Ruth smoked her cigarette down to the stub and glared at him. "Are you telling me you weren't even going to be there if I did enter? What's the point in that? So you're going to be sitting inside the social club playing bloody cards than rather be with me?" John leaned in towards her and put his face close to hers. She could still smell the stout odour of last night's beer on his breath. He almost growled the next few words. "Don't be telling me what I can and can't do. This is my holiday as much as yours. I've worked bloody hard to give us this week off, so the last thing I want is for you to nag at me." He leaned in closer still and lowered his voice. Ruth instinctively shrunk slightly away. "Nag, nag, fucking nag. I don't have to sort you out, do I?" He paused, stared at her and looked straight into her eyes. She saw the size of his pupils increase. A few seconds passed while she heard him breathe. There was no need for him to explain. She knew exactly what he meant. "Let's all have a morning to ourselves, shall we? If you don't fancy the beauty competition, then do something else. The caravan needs a clean-up. Make yourself useful. Then, when Edward goes off again after lunch, you and me can do something then. Understood?" As he came away from her, he looked back towards the other caravans. Their conversation had been discreet enough not to have been heard. Life for all the other holidaymakers was carrying on as before. Ruth watched nervously as his face muscles relaxed and he smiled again. "Better sort out the boy ready for his day, love," he said, raising his voice with a happy tone. "Don't want him being late for pirates, do we? I'm going off now myself to meet up with the lads. The bar ain't open yet, but one of the blokes said he bought some bottles of light ale. Hair of the dog and all that. Meet you by the pool at 1 o'clock and we'll get some chips, eh?" Ruth remained stock still and shut her eyes nervously as he leaned back in to kiss her on the cheek, turned and walked away. She watched as he put his hands in the pocket of his crumpled trousers and heard him whistle gently to himself. This was the John she hated. Getting away for a week was fun, especially for Edward, but for him to spend most of the day and night in that social club. And who were these men he had met? She had seen a few couples last night at the sing-along. Edward was tucked up in bed and the drink was flowing. Having a patrol around the camp listening for children crying meant that all parents could relax in the club and just keep an eye out on the blackboard in case their caravan number was chalked up under the baby crying list. She was always skittery about leaving Edward for too long, so she left reasonably early, which allowed her husband to stay on. By about 10 o'clock they were normally getting louder as the pints mounted up, so she never really got to know the others around the table. The last couple of nights John had returned around midnight and promptly woke her with his clanging about in the small caravan. Luckily Edward was so tired out from his day that he slept through the noise. It was all slurred apologies, and she knew not to confront him when he was drunk. The double bed was hard but bearable, and she would just turn over, but last night he had spread-eagled himself and had begun to snore like a pig. That was when she had told him to sleep on the makeshift double in the kitchenette. Having it down had restricted her space in the caravan, but anything was better than his noise next to her ear. Maybe she was being hard on him. It was his holiday after all, and he did work very hard. They were going to meet up after lunch so they could spend a few hours together then. Ruth turned and stepped back to open the door to their home for the week. It would be all right. "Come on, Edward," she called out. "Let's see if we've got something for you to turn you into the baddest pirate ever." Edward loved being on holiday. On this holiday in particular. It might be the only proper one he had ever experienced in his 9 years. The weekends away didn't count. But it was the best as far as he was concerned. He loved his mum and dad, but he loved being away from them as well for the day. The staff at the holiday camp were always on hand to sweep away the children from their parents until lunchtime. They would then split into their various groups. The full boarders and half boarders would be trotted off to the dining hall for a 2-course meal, and the caravan kids would meet their parents at the pool. What they had then was usually whatever the mum and dad could afford. It may be sandwiches and a fizzy drink, or maybe the local chip shop just outside the village. Edward always wanted chips for lunch, and today was no exception. Sometimes he hadn't felt like eating and just wanted to keep playing, but once the steaming fried potato enveloped in newspaper was placed in his hands, he was normally quite happy to eat them. They had been playing pirates in the local wood on the opposite side of the holiday camp. The paper hat and eye patch was provided by the young member of staff, Bobby. His mum had bravely tried to recreate one that morning in the caravan, but they didn't have the right stuff. He didn't want to tell her that they were going to be given one anyway, as his mum was so keen. He had tucked hers in his pocket out of sight. There were 20 boys today, with ages ranging from 7 years old to 14. Edward had been hitting it off with a boy called Barry. He had told Edward that his father owned a factory, and his mother does nothing all day. They were on the full board in one of the holiday flats, and he hated it. His father had brought them here so they could mix in with what his dad referred to as the working class. Barry liked to swear and make Edward laugh. He kept shouting, "Bastard!" at the top of his voice whenever he thought Bobby wasn't listening. Edward thought this was hilarious, as they knew that Bobby couldn't do anything. "If he complains to my father," said Barry on the walk back from the woods to lunch, "then my old man will probably punch him on the nose and have him fired. He sacks people all the time at the factory." "That's amazing," said Edward as he walked alongside. They were roughly the same height, but Barry said that he should always walk on his left. That way they always know where they were. "Does your dad always punch people?" "All the time," replied Barry, picking his nose as they walked. "He's known for it at the factory. It's the only way to keep them in line." "What about your mum? Does he ever hit your mum?" Barry stopped suddenly and looked at Edward. "No way!" he shouted and looked his friend in the eyes. "No man should ever hit a woman. My dad would never dream of it. He says that any bloke that hits a girl is a complete bastard." He shouted this last word, which made Edward giggle again. They carried on walking. "Does your dad hit your mum then?" he asked. Edward shook his head in embarrassment, unsure what to say. "Not really. I often hear them shouting at each other, and one morning my mum did have some marks on her neck. Red, you know. Then they bruised up a little, but she didn't say anything, and they were fine with each other after that." "If you need my dad to come over and punch your dad in the face, Then I'm sure he'll do it if I ask him. Barry then did something Edward thought was remarkable and put his arm around him. It felt comforting. He had never had another boy do that to him in all of his life. They neared the main area. It was busy with noisy children and patient parents wanting their lunch. You want to come to dinner with me in the main hall tomorrow night? I'm sure my dad can fix it to get you in. You're my best mate, Edward. They were walking with their feet in unison now, so Edward put his arm over that of his friend and smiled. That would be brilliant, he said. After they arrived and Barry had ran to his parents shouting behind him, See you in an hour, Edward went over to the pool area to find his mum and dad. He was hungry and looking forward to the chip shop again. He didn't know when it was the best time to mention about going with Barry to the food hall tomorrow night, but was sure it would be okay, especially with Mum. She would always let him do different things and was always glad when he made new friends. She always thought he was a little quiet when back at home, kept asking him if he wanted to bring a friend round after school, but Edward never did. He didn't have a lot of buddies as such. He liked to keep himself to himself. He was never bullied, but didn't want any attention either. There were a couple of boys in his class he connected with. They made each other laugh all the time by pretending to be the goons. None of them could remember any of the scenes from the shows, but they liked to imitate the voices and characters. Edward knew it was silly, and their group often got a funny look from the older children, but at least he felt part of a gang. Barry made him laugh too. Putting their arms around each other just now had given Edward a special bond and a closeness he rarely felt. His mum would pamper him and give him the odd cuddle while he was in bed, or spit on her handkerchief to tenderly wipe off a dirt mark on his forehead, but this seemed different somehow. His dad very rarely showed him any loving attention. It seemed as though being a man never involved any physical contact as an act of love. The occasional shake of his shoulder or picking him up to put him on a wall seemed to be the limits of his father's capabilities. It was okay. Proper men never hug each other, he would say to Edward, especially if they had witnessed a goal in some local football match and the players were all leaping over each other. One time they had even noticed one man approach the goal scorer and kiss him fully on the cheek. Pair of shirt-lifters, his father had shouted to them. Edward hadn't understood what he meant at the time until a school friend had explained it in the voice of Bluebottle. That had seemed hilarious. His father could be funny without even knowing it sometimes. As he approached the pool, Edward looked around him for his parents. The poolside was very busy and very noisy. The pool itself was rectangular and appeared lined with people, many with their legs dangling in the water. The sun was glinting off the liquid and appeared to make it shine. It seemed everyone in the whole camp had crammed themselves around the water today. A lot were dressed in just trunks or bathing suits. The little children were naked as usual. There was no point in dressing a child of that age up. They ran around giggling and laughing without a care in the world. There was a lifeguard seated at the end, and he seemed not much older than the children playing. Edward often had his doubts of swimming in such a small area, and felt a bit queasy at all those bodies and babies peeing into it. He wasn't a strong swimmer. Never really liked the sensation of water being over his head. It made him panic. Better, he thought, to be a pirate. He knew they were always sailing the high seas looking for buried treasure, but they never swam in the sea. After looking round the edge twice, Edward eventually noticed his mother. She was on her own and had a face that he had seen before. It was the kind of face she often wore after one of his parents' arguments, almost at the brim of tears. He wondered if that was the case. Did she have any more marks on her face? He would check and, if necessary, tell Barry later. Maybe his father could smack his dad in the mouth like his friend said he could. Maybe. "Mum," he called, and waved his arms frantically. She still hadn't seen him. She seemed very distracted. "Mum," He called again, and this time she saw him. Immediately the whole of her face changed and lit up into a bright big smile. She turned and weaved her way around her fellow holidaymakers. "There you are," she said as they drew closer. "So glad to see you, Teddy Bear. How was your morning? Shall we go and get some chips then? Come and hold my hand and we'll get cracking. I'm hungry too." Without waiting for an answer to the barrage of questions, she grabbed his hand and started to march away from the crowded area. After a few moments, when they were out of the camp and onto the road that led into the village, Edward looked up at her. "Where's Dad?" he asked, and instantly heard her take a sharp intake of breath. "He's not coming with us this time, Edward," she said quietly. "He's been delayed at the clubhouse with those new friends of his. You know how that is, don't you? Making new friends. You want to make the most of the time you have, just like you and your new pals here. So it's just you and me today. But that's okay, isn't it? Means we can have more chips between us." She smiled again and tried to look reassuring. Edward smiled back and didn't reply. He didn't want to upset her further. He knew she wouldn't eat much at lunchtime. She would just light up one of those horrible cigarettes of hers and nibble a few of his chips. He loved his mum and really wanted to say something, but she still looked a little sad. He kept quiet and smiled. They arrived at the shop within a few minutes and were lucky to find themselves without a queue. He thought this was strange as how people could not find chips, the ultimate meal. Maybe it was too hot. The man behind the counter was certainly sweating as he was covering some white fish in a pale-coloured sloppy batter. Edward watched with fascination as two small round droplets of sweat made their way down from the man's wet forehead, past either side of his nose as though in a motor race, and found his mouth to finally fall gently onto the batter. Without even having a chance to formulate, the fillet was then slid into the hot, fatty oil with an almighty sizzle. The rumour around the camp was that he always spat in the hot fat to test it if it was ready or not. Edward didn't care. It was only spit, wasn't it? "Would you like a small piece of fish?" his mother asked him, oblivious to the spectacle that he had just witnessed. "It's okay. Thanks, Mum," he replied with a giggle. "Suit yourself," she said, and pointed to the jar on the counter. "Two of those as well, please." The man reached over and unscrewed the lid of the jar and dipped his hand into the clear liquid. With that, he grabbed two of the white objects and plonked them onto the chips, wrapping it all up in several sheets of newspaper. His mum paid and they went outside into the warm air. "Let's go and sit at that bus stop," she said, pointing opposite. "Eat them while they're hot." She took his hand and guided him over to sit on the bench. The village was very quiet, almost as if it didn't want to be disturbed. It was a welcome relief from the noise of the camp. She unravelled the paper and instantly the smell of the food wafted up into his nose. There was nothing like it. "I want you to try one of these. A treat, since it's just me and you." Edward saw her pick up one of the white objects that he had seen in the jar at the shop and offer it to him. "Well, go on then, take it," she said. Edward grabbed it and looked up at her. "It's just an egg, Mum," he replied, and gave her a quizzical look. She smiled at him. Such a sweet smile. "Not just an ordinary egg, darling boy. This is the ultimate egg. This, Edward Teddy Bear Dargett, is a pickled egg." This was the first time since they had met at lunchtime that he could see some spirit in her face. As he raised it to his mouth and looked, her face lit up. He bit down on the egg white and his mouth was suddenly filled with vinegar and the chalky solid yolk. It almost took his breath away and he choked. His mum actually laughed. "Smashing, eh?" she said with delight. "One of my favourites, this is." He looked up and saw the sparkle in her eyes. She looked back at him. "I could eat these all day. I just wanted you to try one. Your dad hates them, so we never buy them." Edward saw the brief spark seep away. Do you want the rest of mine?" he said quietly. I don't like it." Give it here then, you daft sausage. I'll tell you what, you have the chips and I'll have the eggs. She reached over and took his half-eaten egg and popped it straight into her own mouth. Edward thought that now was his chance. Does Dad ever hit you, Mum? Is that why you're sad? Are you going to get a divorce? She suddenly stopped chewing the egg in her mouth and looked at him. Her eyes, full of that sparkle a few seconds ago, now seemed like piercing spheres of black. She knew she couldn't answer immediately to defend herself because of the food in her mouth, so Edward got a small chance to see her honest reaction. He saw sadness and a little fear. Finally, he watched as she swallowed quickly and licked her lips of any residue. "What a set of questions, Teddy Bear," she said, swallowing to give her time to speak. "Why are you asking me this? Is that what you think?" "He hasn't come with us to lunch, and you've got a red mark on your cheek, and my friend Barry says—" Whoa, Edward," she interrupted him. Edward stopped talking. She put her hand on his knee and gripped slightly. "First of all, your father is busy with his new friends at the clubhouse and can't get away. He's really sorry to miss our chippy lunch, but he says he'll make it up to you tomorrow. Second of all, silly, I've scratched my cheek on the grill at the caravan. I was bending down to put away the greasy pans left over from cooking breakfast for you pair of hungry bears I live with. And finally, as for listening to your new friend—" She leaned in so close to his face that Edward could smell the vinegar on her breath from the pickled egg. "You pay him no attention, do you understand? It's none of his beeswax about what goes on in our family. He should have more manners than that." With that, she leant in closer still and kissed him on the forehead. "Now, have I answered all your questions, my little interrogator?" Edward again saw the little twinkle reappear. "Yes, Mum," he replied, and went to carry on with his chips. They were his favourite meal, but only when they were hot. He couldn't stand cold chips. It felt like eating wet slugs. "Anyway, I was only going to tell you that if you want someone to punch Dad in the face, then Barry said that his dad would happily do it." With that, he picked up the newspaper-clad chips and began to walk back to the camp entrance. He looked back at her, still sitting there on the bench with her mouth agape. "Better get back, Mum. Don't want to be late for afternoon play. I think it's rounders." The afternoon whizzed by as it always did when it's halfway through the holiday week. The first couple of days slowly go by as you find your way around. Once a routine is established, it seems to speed up until the week is suddenly over. Ed would wonder why that was never the same with school. That was a routine every day of every week. The time that sped by on this day was, as he had thought, a very long game of rounders. Drinks were supplied due to the hotness of the weather, and virtually all the boys stripped down to their shorts and plimsolls. Edward liked to tie his shirt around his waist. He was very skinny for his age and knew that the string holding his shorts up would sometimes become loose. That would be the ultimate embarrassment in his eyes if everyone saw his pants. Barry, as usual, had a different take on it and claimed he had already touched a girl down there, and she had touched him until he had hardened up, so was quite proud of his thing. Edward hadn't understood what he meant and didn't believe him anyway. They were both 9 years old. He didn't want to go anywhere near girls, let alone have any physical contact with them. Soon enough, it was time to return back to the main complex again. "Bloody hell," said Barry as they packed up the equipment and followed Bobby back to the main camp. "All we seem to do is eat on this holiday. I'm amazed I'm not a big doughboy rolling along this field." Both boys laughed. "Did you ask your mum about coming to the dining hall for dinner tomorrow after club?" he asked. Edward shook his head. "My mum was in a funny mood lunchtime, so I'll ask her tomorrow." "Didn't have a black eye, did she? A present from your dad, like?" "Shut up, Barry." Edward turned to his friend with an expression of anger. "That's not fair. You don't know my dad. Mum says to keep your nose out. Barry smiled and held up his hands in a mock surrender. Okay, I was only joking, you silly bastard. Maybe I'll get my dad to come over to your caravan anyway on the last night. Give him a small bonk on the nose. He'll do it as well. Do you know why? With this, he put both his hands to his mouth to make a cone shape to shout. Because he's a mad bastard. Both boys giggled again as Bobby turned his head round and glared at them. Gotta go now, Edward, said Barry. I think it's sponge pudding and custard tonight. See you in the morning. With that, he gave Edward a playful thump on his shoulder and ran off towards the food hall. Edward felt pain where Barry had thumped him. His shoulders were red from the afternoon on the field. He felt thirsty and suddenly very tired. He wished he could have sponge pudding and custard tonight. His mum had probably cooked some more sausages and heated some baked beans. He hoped they weren't going to the club tonight. He didn't feel like it now. He might just lay on his bed after tea and reread one of the comics Mum had bought him especially for the holiday. The Dandy was his favourite, but he also liked the Commando book. It looked a bit grown up for him, but his dad said it was all about history and beating the Nazis, so he was to make sure he read it. As he walked to the outer perimeter of the camp towards his caravan, Mum had walked him around the edge of the whole camp on the first day so he could remember where theirs was. He glanced in at all the caravans with their doors open. As far as he could see, they all looked identical. There was a thin washing line attached to each of the caravans, and all were full with an assortment of clothing all dancing in unison with the wind. Some of the men were sitting on the step or on a deck chair close by. Some were wearing vests, while some were topless with red skin like Edward's. There were numerous cigarette butts strewn around each entrance. Edward could hear the distinctive tin sound of a portable radio trying to blast out the hits of the top 20 and failing to compete with the screams and crying of the younger children all running around. The odour of fatty meat drifted out of virtually all of them as he passed, and this made him feel very hungry. Sausages and beans with a glass of orange pop seemed like heaven to him now, and he quickened his walk. A few of the older children called out to him, and he recognised them from earlier, but he ignored them and hurried on. His day was nearly complete. He would ask his dad if he was allowed to read his magazines on his bed so they could go to the club by themselves. Mum loved the bingo and even had her own dobber. The previous night he had been allowed one game card to keep him quiet, but it all seemed a bit dull. Some of the women around him on the other tables had 6 cards at one time and would be frantically crossing off numbers while shushing everyone to be quiet. It looked very serious and no fun at all. He didn't fancy that tonight. He finally reached his caravan, but although the door was open, all seemed quiet inside. "Mum, Dad, I'm home," he called and climbed the steps. The door led straight into the kitchen area and his parents weren't there. Maybe they were in the bedroom, he thought to himself, and then regretted the image that shot into his brain. He had thought he heard his parents about a year ago back at home one Sunday afternoon after lunch. They had been in the local pub. The 3 of them then had Sunday roast together and then left him to do the washing up while they went to bed for a couple of hours. After he had dutifully done the dishes and pans, he had decided he wanted to play outside and went to their bedroom to ask. Without thinking, he pushed open the door to see his dad lying on top of his mum. The blankets were fully up to their necks, but both were breathing heavy, and it looked as though one was trying to suffocate the other, so Edward quickly left, pulling the door quietly behind him. He felt odd and quite nauseous, hoping the matter would not be brought up once they had returned from their nap. He hadn't heard them recently, so assumed it was just a one-off. Edward decided to call again before checking the rooms, and this time he heard his mother respond. "In the bedroom, Edward," she called. "It's just me. Come on in." He opened the door to find his mum sitting on the bed. Her legs were pulled tight together with her hands tucked underneath her. In a funny sort of way, it reminded him wanting to go for a wee. "Where's Dad?" he asked. "Always asking for your dad," she replied with a voice almost withholding a tremble. Shame he's never here to hear it, eh? She pulled her hand from under her and proceeded to brush away some imaginary dirt on her skirt. Just me and you tonight, Teddy Bear. I'm afraid it's only bread and cheese for dinner, as I don't want to cook anything. Bought you a cake, though, for pudding. Have you had a good day? It was great, thanks, he replied, and noticed that sad look in her eyes again. Bread and cheese is fine, Mum. Are you having any with me? What? After that big chippy lunch? Are you trying to get me fat, Edward? She rose from the bed and picked up her cigarettes. I'll just stick with these for the moment. You carry on and have as much as you like. I'm just going outside for a bit and then we'll have our quiet night in. Make a change, eh? She brushed past him and ruffled his hair as she did so. He watched her go outside, sat herself into the deck chair and lit up. He watched her breathe in through the cigarette, the recognisable crisp noise it made as the tip glowed orange, the almost intense sigh she made as the smoke was breathed in, held inside her lungs for a few moments, and then blown out with some velocity. Edward didn't understand about the smoking. He knew that it smelt a bit and the full ashtrays at home reeked, but realised that it was one thing that made his mum feel content. That was a good thing. He didn't think this holiday was making her happy. The late afternoon turned into the early evening, and their area began to quieten down as most of the neighbours ventured down to the social club for that night's entertainment. Edward was laying on his bed and was still full of bread and cheese and his favourite orange pop. So full, in fact, that the cake his mum had got for him still lay on the kitchen side untouched. He had read his commando comic from start to finish and daydreamed of a life capturing the Nazi paratroopers that were so vividly portrayed in the drawings. The caravan was getting darker now as the sun had finally dipped away and the night sky started to appear. His mum was still outside, having come in only once to use the toilet and make a cup of tea for herself. There was still no sign of his father. He suddenly realised how tired he was and let out the most almighty yawn which nearly dislocated his jaw. He wanted to sleep, but at the same time wanted to keep awake for his dad. Did it matter? He thought to himself. He'll see him tomorrow morning, and that meant only one more day till their time was up and they would pack up to go home. That made him a little sad. He stretched and felt the rawness of his shoulders rub on the starched sheet of his bed. It was a slow, numbing pain, and he knew that he'd have to sleep in just his pants tonight. The caravan wasn't very well ventilated, and it looked as though it was going to be warm again. He closed his eyes briefly and began to go through his day. It was the noise that made him open his eyes. Almost in disbelief, he saw that the room was dark. Instinctively, he felt for his blanket and found that he had been tucked in and his clothes removed, leaving just his pants. He must have fallen asleep, but now he was wide awake and his heart was thumping in his chest. His body felt clammy with sweat. He lay there for a moment, afraid to move, and listened. There it was again. Still distant, but getting nearer. Shouting. Men's voices. Angry voices. The cluster of caravans in the middle of the night emitted no sound, only the natural noise of night creatures or the occasional baby. But this was no normal night sound. This was a mixture of low but insistent voices rising slowly up in volume and pitch as they got closer and closer. Just a crowd of men returning from the club, thought Edward. Too much beer. He'd seen it with his dad before. They were probably talking about United or City, almost teasing each other with their drunken boasts and denials. A bit of banter is all, his father had said one day, returning back to the house with a couple of his friends and a few bottles of beer. This sounded like no banter he had heard before. The voices sounded aggressive. As the noise got closer and the voices became more clearer, Edward realised with terror that one of the voices was that of his father. His mum, too, must have made the connection, for he heard movement outside his door and a shuffling sound, and his mum was clearly trying to dress in a hurry. "Mum," he called, unable to hold back the panic in his voice. Mum! Stay in your room, he heard her say just outside the door. I'm going to find out what's going on. Stay in your room, she repeated. His heart pounded in his chest, with sweat on his forehead gradually pumping out all over his body. Edward stayed motionless from the neck down. This was no Commando magazine. His body refused to move. Still, the voices came nearer. Now he could hear snippets of speech. You're a fucking liar, said one voice. You pay us what's due, you cheating bastard, said another. Shove it up your arse and leave me alone, said another, his dad's voice. Edward heard the growl in his tone, but also one of defensive panic, as though of an animal backed into a corner with its hackles up. Now he heard the front door of the caravan open. John! Screamed his mum's voice. What's going on? Why are you shouting? Her voice seemed shrill. She got no answer. John! She screamed again. What in God's name? Stay out of this roof and close the door, her husband replied. I'm going to sort this. Now Edward sat straight up, his eyes wide. He could feel the blood pumping through his veins like an express train. His dad's voice was close, within yards of his bed. He slung back his blanket and faced his tiny side window. The curtain was small and brown with just enough fabric to prevent light from coming in. He noticed that there was a lot more light from outside now. More voices from all around. What's going on? And, keep the bloody noise down, will ya? All began to add to the noise as more and more surrounding caravans turned on their lights and peeked out of their windows to find out what the commotion was. Edward took a deep breath and pulled back his own curtain. What he saw made him gasp. The area just outside the caravan was now flooded with light that emitted from the neighbours and their own front door where his mother stood. His father was approaching closely, followed by two men. His father hadn't seen him as his head was down, but as it was raised, Edward saw blood clearly on his father's nose and a few drops quite visible on his white shirt. Ruth, get inside for fuck's sake! Edward could hear his mum crying. Now he saw the two other men as they caught up with his dad. You ain't getting away, you cheating fucking chode, called the closest one. The man seemed older to Edward, but built solidly like a bull terrier. He was wearing a dark shirt, black trousers with red braces. There were dark marks on his forearms that were like service tattoos. His hands were tightened into fists. His facial expression oozed rage. Turn around and face me, fuckwit, he cried, as he was in arm's length of Edward's dad. Bizarrely, John did as requested, and as he turned, he raised his arms as a kind of peace offering. That was when the man landed the first punch, straight into the stomach. All the air in John's lungs came out all at once in a kind of whoomph sound, and he immediately bent his stomach over. However, in doing so, left his face exposed and the man's knee raised to meet his face with some force. An ugly cracking sound was heard, and a stream of blood suddenly flew upwards. John's knees began to buckle as he tried to gurgle some words from his ruined mouth. Pitbull Man grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled John's back close to him, so his face was next to his ear. Don't fucking say a word, chode. You've had your chance. His words spat into John's ear. Keeping him vertical by holding him close, he spun round to face the other man now arriving. This man was smaller, thinner, and balding with spectacles and a cloth cap. In one of his hands he held a piece of piping about 12 inches long and rusted. His face was again grimacing with anger. Run away like a fucking mother's boy then, did you? Let's sort that out, shall we? He shouted, looking straight at John. He then raised the piping high and brought it down in a speeding arc onto John's shins with a sickening crunch. The blood-curdling scream from his dad's mouth set Edward to stone. He stood by his little window, stock still, his eyes wide and his pupils allowing the horrific action to sink in and fuse into his memory cells. All of the adjoining caravans were witness to this beating, yet no one moved. No one came out, but all watched with shock. Even Edward's mother had stopped crying and was standing in the open doorway in utter disbelief. As John collapsed to the ground, a bone visibly sticking out from his shin, the older man looked over to her. He gave her a weird smirk before he spoke. "Didn't pay his debts, love," he said to her almost casually. "So we either do him or come over there and fucking rape you in front of that son of yours. Watch it if you want. Just no more screaming. All right." At that moment, Bulldog Man then moved his head slightly to face Edward behind his window glass. He looked at him right in the eyes, boring into him, and then winked with his right eye. It was almost as if he had thrown a punch at Edward. A small trickle of warmth was going down the boy's leg, but he still could not move from his spot. Edward watched as the man laughed to himself and turned back to the stricken body on the floor. He leant down at the distraught figure writhing slowly. The thinner man stood slightly back and was gently tapping his leg with the piping. There was blood on the metal. "We should really leave it there," the pitbull man said slowly, aiming his speech to John. "Thing is, though, you've been with us all day, drunk all our beer, and then you walk away without paying your debts. You're a greedy bastard who won't give up. I don't think you've learnt your lesson yet, do you?" He leant further down, and for a small moment in time everything was quiet. Out of that quietness a small, weak voice croaked from the ruined figure on the ground. It was barely audible, but it sealed his fate. "Fuck you," it said. What the boy witnessed next was the most savage beating imaginable upon his father, as boot after boot rained in on the head and stomach. The piping was thrown down with a clang while the steel-toed boots from both men made contact. Blood burst from the ears, and the head was a mass of dirty hair and broken skin. A tooth flew out with comic effect and lay gleaming on the ground like a gem. It seemed to those watching to be like an eternity, but after a few minutes the two men suddenly stopped. They were panting heavily. Sweat was dripping off both faces and onto the broken body on the ground. "Let's leave it," Pitbull Man gasped, looking at his friend. "Oh, getting too old for this. Come on, we'll leave this bitch to tidy the heap of shit up." The thinner one laughed, highly amused, and nodded his agreement. Both men turned, still fighting for breath as though on a run, and slowly walked back towards the complex. As their footsteps retreated and faded away, the area returned to almost complete quietness. The body on the dirt floor lay motionless. Further away on the other side of the camp, the sound of a crying child could be heard, desperate for his mother's attention. Only the faintest of whimpers came from the mother of the 9-year-old boy who had watched their husband and father beaten to death in front of their eyes.